Hands-on science without sense-making is just arts and crafts. Leslie Lausten. In this episode of It's Time for Science, it's time to talk about the science of reading. Our guests are Leslie Lausten, Professional Learning Specialist for FOSS Science, and Dr. Jen Slavick, Director, K-12 Research Partner Engagement and Success at EAB. Leslie and Jen are the authors of the whitepaper, FOSS Enhances the Science of Reading Through Knowledge Building, which you can get by clicking on the links in the description. We will be talking a lot about how the FOSS program and curriculum specifically is very centered around the science of reading and how it can help kids with their literacy skills, but also how important science education is overall for schools and districts that want to improve literacy across the board. We talk about what exactly the science of reading is, how sections of students' brains have to work together to take text and turn it into knowledge, the importance of incorporating background knowledge, and how kids can become experts in science vocabulary through relating it to their actual experiences. Well, it's time for science, and it is time to talk about the science of reading. The concept of how science education can cross over through every other subject in school, especially in reading and language development, has come up in nearly every episode of this show. As kids explore the world around them, they have to develop the skills to express what they're discovering. And today, we have two experts to talk with us about the science of reading through knowledge building. Dr. Jen Slavick, Director of the K-12 Research at EAB, and Leslie Lausten, the Professional Learning Specialist for School Specialty, collaborated on a white paper on this very subject. And we're going to dive deep on how science education and hands-on curriculum like FOSS can help you meet the demands of teaching literacy. So, Dr. Jen Slavick and Leslie Lausten, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
So I want to talk about the big subject first, which is the science of reading. Now, as a lay person or somebody who just reading, it's just reading. But what is the science of reading? Leslie, what does that mean to you?
When you think about reading education over the years, there's many different definitions of how we teach reading. And the one thing we can all agree on is that reading boils down to two big main areas. One of them is word recognition, and that's your phonics, your phonemic awareness, your all of that area. And then the other part that we need is our knowledge building area. And that is your vocabulary, your comprehension, even grammar and language structure, as well as your verbal reasoning and being able to think through text a little bit more, as well as your basic genres and concepts and all of that.
Jen, what do you have to add to that? How do you view the science of reading?
I think the points that Leslie brought up are really important. I think it's important to also to name that like all the components of reading that Leslie talked about. We've known about the way kids learn to read for over 30 years, but we've had this dialogue happening where it was a lot disconnected from K-12. And I think when we think about our brains, the reason why this is very scientific approach is the fact that our brains aren't actually innately wired to read. We're wired to speak. And so it actually takes students need to actually learn how to coordinate 4 different regions in their brain to actually take text and turn it into knowledge. And so this early literacy focus on phonics and language development and vocabulary development, once they learn how to put the language together, then we couple that with language comprehension or background knowledge so that they're no longer focusing more on like producing the words, but once they actually produce the word, they've heard it before and they know kind of what it means. And so when we put those two things together, then kids can actually understand text. But it is a coordination of 4 parts of the brain that weren't originally meant to work together. And that's, I think, the most important part about why this is happening, why we have to focus on this with kids and we can't just, do this the way that we've been doing it for a long time.
It explains a lot to me because I think I only have 3 working parts of my brain. So I didn't realize there were more. That's awesome. So Leslie, we were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add that part of the reason that this has all been proved about the brain and brain research is because of our newest technology, and they've been able to take some shots of the brain through MRI imaging, and they can actually see what parts of the brains are working when children and adults are reading. So that's like the latest, and that's why I believe why we've added science to it, because science is proving that that's where the brain is working for those four different parts.
One of the parts of your white paper that I found really interesting was the Scarborough's reading rope concept. And so we're going to go over that because it has multiple sections that we're going to talk about: language comprehension, verbal reasoning, and all of those kind of things. So, what is the Scarborough's rope in general? Let's talk about that. Leslie, what is that?
Yeah, and I guess I started with that a little bit because when I did my reading certification and endorsements, I really spent a lot of time digging into Scarborough's reading rope. And I was able to really see that there are two parts of reading instruction. And like I said earlier, we have that word recognition part, which is your phonics and your phonological awareness and decoding. But what we're going to focus on here with FOSS is the language comprehension side, or the knowledge building side. And through that, we learn about how children really take all the different parts and pieces of the text to make sense of it. And they need to do that by using background knowledge. We often say that children who are exposed to multiple events, multiple phenomena, are able to then read about it a lot easier than children who have not experienced those things. And so that's where background knowledge really plays an important part, and how FOSS can really help to support that.
Jen?
No, 100%. I have nothing to add because Leslie hit it right on the head.
I like how it just how science ties into this. So the whole thing of having to explain what you just learned and all that, it just prompts kids so much easier, I would think. So that's what we're talking about here. And then the next step was vocabulary. How does that
Yes.
tie in?
You want to talk about that, Jen?
Well, yeah. So when we think about the way that children are taking the information, when we think about the science of reading, what we teach students to do is to sound out the word through phonics, and that is the early part of literacy, where we're teaching them how to like recognize parts of words. They sound out the word. Once they sound out the word and they say it out loud, that is your vocabulary. So they're going to say that thing out loud, but if that thing means nothing to them, then it's hard for them to make any connection, which is why that background knowledge is really important. And that's where, the our entire world is kind of wrapped up in science. We can't really understand much of what's going on around us if we don't understand science, because it's happening everywhere. And so kids are most likely to pick up a lot of vocabulary in context through the scientific world surrounding them. So as we work with them and prioritize science, then they have that vocabulary that they've heard before, that they've had the physical experience. They know what that thing is. They've seen the word before in practice. So when they say it out loud, it clicks for them. They're like, oh, got it. I've got this word. I've got this understanding, and I can now make sense of the passage that I'm reading or the work that I'm reading through. So they really do go hand in hand. And building that content knowledge through firsthand experience is the best way for students to retain the language that they're hearing, because it's very sticky. It sticks with them.
I often talk about how my son did not learn the word ball because I held up a flashcard of ball and introduced him what ball was. He learned ball because he wanted to kick that ball and he needed me to go get that ball. And he learned it in context that way. And it's the same is true for our FOSS lessons, where we start off with the word that they use to describe something. And then we teach them the scientific word that actually means the same thing. So we're tying synonyms to those words from the get go. We're saying them orally way before we read them, way before we write them. And they're posted throughout our room throughout the entire lesson. And so it's really important the kids become experts in using these scientific vocabulary as they're learning, because it's related to that firsthand experience that they have already done through active investigation.
The next part of the reading rope is language structure. How does that tie in, Leslie?
Yeah, so with that, I think FOSS does a really good job of helping our students to develop language structure through sentence frames. So, one of the things I noticed when I was teaching fourth grade was that our children nowadays are so inundated with slang and even like text talk that they're not really speaking in complete sentences. And so we had to spend so much time on the difference between a fragment and a sentence that I began to see, wow, these kids really aren't speaking in complete sentences. So before you can write a complete sentence, you have to be able to speak a complete sentence. And FOSS does a beautiful job of providing sentence frames with proper nouns and your verbs and subject verb agreement and all of that, so that our children learn how to speak them before they write them, before they read them. And that is something that's already embedded into the curriculum, which is really nice, because oftentimes as a classroom teacher, we have so many things on our plate to stop and think about, well, how can I make them speak better about science, or how can I help them to write better? It's already embedded, and children are, encouraged to rewrite, re-speak until they say to use that language structure appropriately.
Jen?
Yeah, I concur. I think what's interesting about FOSS is with so many of the experts on the writing staff, like the literacy experts on the writing staff, they've done such a great job of building additional resources as well, where teachers can go in and find more information. So not only does the investigations guide itself have sentence frames that we can use with students or prompt students with in the margins of the teacher's guides. It's right there. It's also on our slides, but it's also, we have multiple chapters about next step strategies that we might do with students. So for example, when students do an assessment of any kind, so whether it be an embedded assessment or a benchmark assessment, where, in their notebook entries, when teachers look at that, there's, especially when it comes to like the notebook entries and answering focus questions, students are trying to communicate their idea. We ask them to incorporate the language that they've learned in the lesson. We provide them sentence frames, but when we teach teachers about the reflective assessment practice, when you look at what students are saying, there's actually kind of like two layers to how you might support students. And we talk about this in our notebook chapter in particular with the focus question responses, which is like, is it a content issue or is it a communication issue? Is it a writing communication issue? And so we're constantly supporting teachers in building that practice into their science time as well. So when teachers are authentically doing notebooks and using those embedded assessments, they're actually working with students on both of those concepts, the content plus the communication and language structure. I think, though, I want to lift up one thing. It is important that students be allowed to communicate. Um, there's something like formal language structure that's important, right, in our world, but there's also our children's natural way that they speak. And when we first start working on science concepts, we allow them the space to like speak the way that, like, tell the content, tell their answer in something that's familiar to them, so they can get the idea out. And then we might provide a sentence frame and say, like, how else can we say that using X vocabulary? How else can we say that in this way? And we're like working with students so that they're processing in their for lack of a better word, like their native way of speaking.
Code
Um,
switching.
and and yes, and then we are helping them build language structure as well. So we've got space for both. It doesn't have, it's not a rote way to speak. And that's, I think, really important, because when you're trying to process new science content, if you're processing it formally and that's not the way you normally process things, it makes it even harder to understand the content.
Right. It's kind of funny because, being older, yeah, I'm sure that teachers had to deal with a little bit of slang that would work in, but nothing like today. I mean, entire language is changing. I follow a couple of etymology people on Instagram,
Me
actually, and
too.
it's fascinating stuff. It really is, but
Yeah.
it's like light speed now as opposed to how it used to evolve. So
Hmm.
definitely a problem. And this is a wonderful way to help. I think that's great. So the next part of the reading rope concept is verbal reasoning. So Leslie, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so verbal reasoning is basically what Jen was talking about. It's how do they process the information that they're learning. And with verbal reasoning, we're really looking at some of the harder parts of comprehension, like your inferencing, and metaphors and different things like that. And with our children, we know that they need to speak it, and I've said this and over again today, but they need to speak it through first. And
Yep.
so, one of the ways that we do a good job with that is what we call sense making. And so, this is where we tie in those cross cutting concepts of cause and effect, of looking at ways that there are patterns and comparing and contrasting. And we do all of that through sense making. And our children are able to really internalize and synthesize what they have learned through the active investigation, and they draw their pictures in their notebooks, they add diagrams to them, and then they, through talking it all out, we connect that content to the lesson, and they're able to wrap it up nicely.
Jen?
Yeah, I agree. Sense making is like the most critical component, and it's funny. FOSS, oftentimes in our professional learning, we talk about the idea that students, they do it and then they speak it and then they write it and then they read it. So we're actually walking through that, reading rope as far as like how it is that we're having students process the new concept and the new vocabulary. So they do it, we introduce the vocabulary, they speak about it with their peers, they work through the verbal reasoning, which ties to the fact that your brain is hardwired to speak, not to read.
Mhm.
So we start with the speaking and then we move into the writing and then we move into the reading. So because reading is the more complex part of all of that work. And so with all of that language development before, it makes the reading more accessible to students. And we're really just following that the brain science that says like this is what kids need to be able to do.
I often say hands-on science without sense making
Hmm.
is just arts and craft, because they don't really tie in the content and all the different parts of it if they aren't coming back and really talking through, now what did we just do? Why
Yep.
did we do it? Because we did this, then this happened. That is what makes it really stick into our children's brains.
We need that on a t-shirt. That'd be it's a great t-shirt thing. And the other part of Scarborough's reading rope is literacy knowledge. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Leslie, what's that all about?
So, literacy knowledge is just your informational text, right? So, we've already, if you think through, we've already exposed our students to some type of active investigation where they're building their background knowledge. We've introduced all of the vocabulary words in context. We've had them speak using sentence frames to speak in complete sentences as needed. And we've talked through everything in our sense making circles with our verbal reasoning. Now it's time to introduce our text. And our text has been, I will say, our developers have done a wonderful job with including our comprehension activities that we have with our informational text. Our informational texts are great because they build off of what the kids have already done. Some of the illustrations are actual illustrations of the activities that the students have done. And during this time of informational text, we are thinking through all of those skills and strategies and best practices, as far as looking for main ideas, as far as stopping and asking interactive read aloud questions. We also have opportunities for students to read and take notes on their own. We have opportunities after they read to respond to the text, as well as opportunities for some graphic organizers for vocabulary that they have been working on throughout this entire lesson. So, just like in our FOSS lessons, once we've built all of that other knowledge building, language comprehension, all those skills, then we introduce our text. And guess what? At that point, the kids can read those big words. They understand what those big words mean. And so they're able to actually comprehend the text much better than if we started with the text where they had no firsthand knowledge.
Jen?
Yeah, and I think it's really great because the students also, I think kids don't always inherently love reading. It's not necessarily some kids' first choice activity. And so when we start our class with a text, it kind of becomes a groaner, especially when we get to like middle school. Elementary school kids are more inclined to just kind of like roll with it. I mean, there are some kids who, don't always roll with it, but when we get to middle school, if you are launching your lessons with a text or you're launching anything with text, it tends to be a groaner for kids. So when we've done these activities and they've engaged with the hands-on, it makes the text so much more meaningful to them that they're actually more excited to engage in the reading and to attempt these harder passages than they may not have been otherwise. And what I love about FOSS is that we have, as Leslie said, like all of those teacher supports in there that are guiding, like, and everything that's appropriate, especially even at the younger ages, about like text, the book structure, even like, let's look at the images, what's the beginning, what's the end, what's the table of cut, all the things that are important parts of early literacy in particular, are all parts that are woven in. But we also have supports for students to engage slightly differently with the text. So we have our physical copies of the books, but we also have a digital copy of this book. And the digital copy of the book allows students to actively digitally engage with it. So it has the ability to read to them. It has the ability for students to highlight in it and take notes in it and do all those things and be interactive, even in the digital format. That helps to bring the text more alive. It's got multimedia embedded into it, so they can extend what they're reading about if they're so inclined or if the teacher asks them to. So there's lots of ways to engage. And I love too that that digital component, the images, we know that not all students have the same experiences, and the hands-on component makes sure that everybody has a similar experience. But even some of the images in the text, many of them come with a video that shows students that thing in action, and it makes it more accessible. So we just have so many ways for students to get to engage with the text in that direct way that just really elevates the experience for students.
Another subject that's come up a few times is how science learning, FOSS, things like that can help in ELD learning, kids learning the language and how they can learn it in their own language, but then they have to speak it in this new language, and now they're excited about it because they're talking about a discovery. Talk a little bit about that in terms of helping ELD people with their reading and literacy. Leslie?
When I will use my real world experiences of teaching FOSS with fourth grade, and I always had a multitude of students in my class, not just ELD students, but also students with special needs, including emotional needs. And with those kids, I found, and their support teachers found, that their language developed so much faster through science than it did in any other subject area. One of the things that I noticed was everything that we are doing in our lessons has been designed, and I will give credit to the developers. It has been designed to increase language comprehension and language development with our children. So I would have students in my fourth grade classroom straight from Afghanistan. My school was in a bedroom community for Quantico, Virginia. So we had a lot of Afghani refugees that came over with our Marines. And so they would spend a lot of time doing the hands on activities with us, speaking to each other in their own language, and then grabbing their Google Chromebook and doing Translate to speak into Google Translate and telling me what they were experiencing. They were able to express in their own language and use Google Translate to then let me hear what they were thinking. And eventually they would pick up 1 to 2 of the new science vocabulary, along with just everyday language that they needed to explain their thinking.
Jen, anything to add to about ELD education?
No, I think Leslie really said everything. One of the things that I love is that we actually have video footage of this working in real time. If you look at some of the the ELD videos, in particular, the teacher resource videos that we have, introductory videos for language development and literacy, show students actually reading and speaking in their own language, talking to their peers, and then either a peer translating for them, or and working together. And then they are able to we actually have another video clip of a student speaking it out loud in Spanish first and then turning it into English. And so like you can see it in real time how effective this structure is in supporting students picking up the language, because they're really processing in both spaces, and they do grow much faster than in many of their other content areas.
Now, as this is a science education podcast, we often talk about how science seems to be pushed aside by a lot of schools or districts. It's, focusing on math or this or that. Whereas what we're talking about here is that it covers all of these things and can truly help your language development. So I'd like to talk about how science meets the demands of teaching literacy at the same time. If a teacher is like trying to express this to their district or their principal or whatever, how would you say science, sum it up in sort of your elevator pitch, I guess, of how it does teach literacy? Leslie.
Again, when I was a fourth grade teacher, I used the informational text as my knowledge building curriculum. I was able to convince my principal to allow me to start off my day with science, followed up with literacy, and we integrated everything. I would really go back and I would actually use those texts for some close reading afterwards. And we spent a lot of time digging into the informational text, as well as everything that we had done within the science lesson to build our literacy. And what ended up happening was I had the best scores. And that's
It's in the pudding.
because the kids were interested, right? And so I would just say that we used to call it a curriculum economy, where we were getting two things done at one time. And because of that, our children were doing really well with everything.
Jen?
Yeah, and the art of integration has really been lost in this world of, different curriculum for every single thing. Like, we don't need that, and kids don't need more and more and more time with something that they're struggling with. We've been trying that for 30 plus years and scores haven't changed. Like, what we need is to begin integrating. Kids need, different spaces to process the thing that they're learning. And I agree, like, I think the biggest place that we can do that is both in your language comprehension. So you don't need a a separate comprehension curriculum. You may need a separate phonics curriculum. That's not something we do, and that makes tons of sense to me. But as Leslie said, if you use it as your comprehension curriculum, and you do the appropriate strategies with it in that way, you're already tackling that. But you also don't need a writing curriculum, because we have such a heavy focus on authentic notebook entries, and it is an actual writing curriculum, like a writing process that kids are going through, and a revising process kids are going through. You can do your writing through that as well, and you don't need a separate writing curriculum. So we don't need all these extra things. We need to think more carefully about the way we're asking kids to spend their time. And if we were going to be really, really honest, the kids who need the most support probably don't feel as successful if we give them more and more time with literacy. If we give them more time with science, we find those students achieve more because they're interested, they're excited, and they feel successful. And therefore, like Leslie said, they'll achieve so much faster.
Dr. Jen Slavick, Leslie Lausten, amazing. Thank you so much for your time. And just such a powerful subject and so important to kids everywhere. And I think teachers have just learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you so much for having us.
It's Time for Science is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lippman and Tom Racine, and is sponsored by School Specialty and FOSS, the full option science system, at the Lawrence Hall of Science, UC Berkeley. Be sure to check out FOSS over on Facebook and Twitter.